Hello everyone and welcome to episode 7 of the ITSM crowd. This episode is the Queen of SIAM and we are very lucky to have with us today the Queen of SIAM herself, Major-Goldsmith from Kinetic in Australia. So we're going to start today's broadcast by asking Michelle to introduce herself. So Michelle, if you want to say hello and tell us a little bit about your background, please.
Great, thanks Claire, and thank you very much for the opportunity to talk to you about SIAM. As you said, I'm now in Kinetic IT, a former Brit. I work in the UK, more lately I guess with CISOP, and then prior to that, a bit of experience in the IT industry, 25 years, much as it pains me, in the thick end as well, so only really been in the consultancy and training market in the last few years. So yeah, I'm here in Kinetic IT. We are very much invested in service management generally, and I guess that's where the interest for SIAM came about.
Thank you very much. And just to introduce myself, my name is Claire Agutter and I'm the lead tutor for ITSM Zone. We provide online service management training and I'm hosting today's session. So SIAM is a bit of a hot topic in service management circles at the moment, and Michelle's the author of an AXELOS white paper that talks about SIAM, which is available on the AXELOS website. So we thought we'd just take a look at SIAM in a little bit more detail and give people some tips and some takeaways really for how SIAM might apply in their environment. So I guess we should start with some definitions, please, Michelle. If you can start by telling us what SIAM actually is.
Sure. Okay. So I think people are starting to hear a lot more about SIAM. There are a number of white papers that have been released, and customers are certainly talking to us about wanting some SIAM, but not necessarily always understanding what it is. SIAM stands for Service Integration Management. So essentially, it seeks to work more closely with providers in complex environments, so maybe where there's a number of service providers at play, to try to build, I guess, integration between those individual suppliers. So still about doing service management, but bringing together a focus on control of the end-to-end accountability for service delivery. Principles of SIAM aren't new to service management. We've been talking about ITIL for a long time, and SIAM is still about that cradle-to-grave approach, but it's much more focused on how do we manage those interfaces between multiple providers within a service delivery model? How do we put control and governance in place? How do we allow a business to carry on doing what it wants to do, but use a SIAM integration model to make sure that all of the providers within that support chain are essentially doing what they're supposed to be doing?
Okay, so what sort of problems in an organisation might lead them to think they need SIAM then?
I think lots of customers are talking to us today about some of the silo situations that they have. So they're choosing lots of different providers, they're wanting to get the benefits of the economic specialisms, but what quite often is happening is that they're making choices essentially based on need, what IT services are going to fulfill our business processes and enable those, but not necessarily getting the benefit of getting those providers working together. And that's the key point. ITIL gives us the ability to be able to define processes for providers to follow, but what we don't necessarily get is that ability to do the end-to-end control. So the individual providers within the service model are essentially focused on their own ends and what they're delivering to the customer without looking at that bigger picture. So I think from a customer's point of view, the challenge they're trying to overcome is how do they get the benefits of having all of these providers and their economic specialisms, but actually still get that view from the user's perspective that it's one end-to-end service. And that's essentially, I guess, where SIAM came into play, because it was more focused on how do we ensure that the individual providers within the model are controlled? How do we put a layer of governance in place to make sure that the customer gets the benefit or the value from having those providers within their support model?
So what we're talking about here is a single organisation that uses multiple suppliers to deliver different parts of the service, and it's just finding different ways to kind of manage those suppliers effectively. Do we need to have suppliers working together?
Absolutely. So again, it needs a definition of more controls, and it takes on board what ITIL has been telling us for a long time around this concept of orchestration of the services, the service lifecycle. So essentially what we're wanting the providers to do is work within a model that establishes the ability to allow them to perform their economic specialism. So we're not wanting to hamper the way that they deliver outcomes by telling them this is the process, this is the tool, but we are setting up for them more of a definition around what inputs we're going to give them, what outputs we expect to see, and how we expect those providers to be working together in this cross-functional, cross-control model. The key to doing it effectively, though, is to actually have a customer who knows that to get that end-to-end control, they need to be very clear about their definition of the strategy. What do they want to achieve? What kind of provider should be within that model? What kind of governance structure they want to put in place? And also to put this enterprise operations in place in terms of, really making sure that from a service design point of view, we are having design solutions based on that whole concept of enterprise architecture in terms of having the definition of platforms and structures and controls and quality that the organisation wants to see enacted out through the service delivery model. I think sometimes maybe customers don't necessarily realise that in order to be able to do SIAM effectively, we need good strategy, we need an ISG and control setting direction, we need good service design. So we need to make sure that we have the ability to be able to understand how the organisation wants services designed. And then what we want to be able to do is to put providers into that designed model, which essentially we can scale up and we can scale down. You can't do that effectively without good strategy and design, which is why we say, it's still based very much on the ITIL model, but it's building additional control that SIAM brings in terms of governance and, I guess, a more laying down of the interfaces, the inputs, the outputs, the controls, the quality layers, the measurements, the continuous service improvement. So it's not that it's completely different, I guess, from the ITIL model, but it is more focused on making sure that the providers can act out their economic specialisms, deliver value to the customer, but actually that SIAM puts that layer of governance or control in place to ensure that the customer actually gets the kind of service support and the delivery of the IT service that they're expecting to serve.
Okay, so I mean, we're talking about a lot of ITIL terminology here. We're talking about having a strategy, having a design. It has been suggested that SIAM is just another flavour of kind of ITIL supplier management. It's just another way of designing and transitioning and operating a service. How is SIAM distinct? Where would it sit within the organisation?
Okay. Again, to a degree, it's absolutely right that it is an adaptation of ITIL's service management principles. I think we all know, we've heard stories of people trying to do ITIL, thinking they bought ITIL, telling us that ITIL in their organisation didn't work. Most of us who've been using ITIL for a long time know that that's nothing to do with ITIL per se, it's about how it's been adopted and adapted. SIAM is more of an evolution in terms of our understanding of how to implement a framework for integrated service management. So ITIL is very much in existence and part of the SIAM model. And it's not that SIAM is bigger or better, but SIAM incorporates not just some of the process structures that we see in ITIL, but also more functional activity. So in terms of your suggestion, where does it sit within the business? There is not one defined model for SIAM, but what we're seeing is that the business, having defined strategy and having suggested how they want services designed, will impose an integration layer there, a SIAM integration layer, which sits and provides the governance of the model. Now, the customer can do the same way with the service providers underneath the model. That's perfectly acceptable. All that we need from the SIAM model is to have that impartiality.
Mm-hmm.
So while SIAM could be done by a business or a customer, the customer might not even have the experience or the appetite to be able to provide that SIAM layer. In the most part, we see the customers just want outcomes. So they want, the outcomes that will support their business process. So whilst they might be able to provide the impartiality to govern the suppliers within the model, we think the far better solution is to have a supplier whose sole purpose is to provide that SIAM governance layer. So underneath the SIAM governance layer, you would have your various service providers within the modular tower. So it's almost, if you imagine at its basic level, a level of three-tiered structure, at the top you've got a layer of governance which has to be customer retained. Yeah. And in that governance layer, you've got things like the strategy, the enterprise architecture, things like business continuity management, procurement and contract management, projects. Those kind of things would sit within the customer domain. Below that, the customer would devolve responsibility for a SIAM layer. And in the SIAM layer, you would typically find things like your service management process ownership. Mm-hmm. You would get supplier management as an operational level. You would get monitoring and audit. You would get CSI. And then below that, as another layer, that is where you essentially get all the goods. So that's what we call the service modules. You've got the internal and external service providers. Underneath that, acting out what the customer actually wants to do. So I think the key point is, who would do that SIAM control layer? The customer could do it, or an impartial supplier can do it. It's entirely up to the customer to make that decision. I think either party doing it runs some risk. The customer might not have the appetite or the experience, and the separate service provider might not be entirely impartial. Okay? There's ways to overcome both of those situations, of course, but it's something that the customer or the business needs to consider.
It is something I was thinking there. If you are, in effect, outsourcing the SIAM layer of responsibility, there must be a huge amount of trust between the customer and the supplier who's providing that SIAM function. If we think about a model where we've got a customer, we've got the SIAM functions being outsourced, and then we've got a number of suppliers underneath that, where would we expect to see the contractual relationships? Would we expect to see individual suppliers contracted to the organisation that's providing the SIAM, or would that contract be in place with the actual customer who sits at the top of that model?
I think, Claire, in an ideal world, it would be where we could build a solution from the ground up. And if we were building that solution, essentially the responsibility for managing suppliers would sit completely honestly with the SIAM. So the business, of course, would have been in consultation in terms of, well, okay, which provider is going to fit in the model? Who do we want to work for us? What stuff do they want us to do based on strategy and design and so on? The SIAM function in that particular situation would have the complete control of the providers underneath them. That's an ideal solution. I guess most of the time we don't have the ability to do that. So we're embarking upon situations where there are already legacy contracts. There are already internal support teams doing different things. And quite often we don't necessarily have the ability to get the SIAM being completely in control of the providers underneath within the model. What we then have to do is make sure that the business or the customer is very overtly and tied into contracts, if we can do that, making sure that the providers within the model know that SIAM has the devolved responsibility and the governance layer to be able to act out the customer's wishes. So it's fantastic in a model where we can start right from the beginning and SIAM can own those relationships. If we can't, we need the business or customer to make sure that the providers within the model know that that devolved responsibility now sits with the SIAM. And it's certainly something that's possible to do.
Yeah, and I think this is an exciting area of service provision, because we have moved towards specialisation and specialist service providers, and the idea of a modular service where elements can be swapped in and swapped out is really appealing from a customer perspective, because you can build a service that delivers customer value whilst still taking advantage of best of breed suppliers or even more economical suppliers if that's what you're looking for as an organisation. But I think one of the key points that you've very rightly highlighted is the customer has to know what they want and what those desired outcomes look like. Otherwise, SIAM itself is kind of starting at a disadvantage. And one of the projects that I worked on was to roll out single IT systems across the health service in the UK. So some very, very large suppliers all trying to work with each other. But sometimes it did feel like that strategy was missing. And in that situation, in a way, it's quite tempting to blame the supplier. But if the actual outcomes and deliverables aren't clear, then that's the fault of the customer. And I think this is maybe an area where businesses as customers are going to have to improve the game as well as the suppliers, because quite often the suppliers are doing the best, but the customer's not been clear on what they actually wanted.
Absolutely. And that is a challenge. I mean, for the most part, you often are left with those legacy environments where you're trying to build an integrated solution, SIAM solution, based on what is already in existence. There's absolutely no question that if you want maturity, you go back to the stuff that we read in ITIL. You know, in strategy and in service design, we talk about these concepts of loose coupling and modularity. The ability to be able to monitor each of the providers in the chain and for them to know exactly why they're there, and if they're not performing, to be able to swap them out is very, very exciting. But you can't do that if you have an environment which is essentially, looks like it's been cobbled together like Frankenstein's monster, which is essentially where most of us work. You know, there's lots of environments where, you know, it's been glued together over a period of time. That's not the same as having a defined approach to service design, whereby you have those modules that are extensible. You can bring them in, you can move them out, you can grow them, you can decrease them. That's what's appealing to a customer today. But of course, as we're saying, they need to be in a position to really make good strategic decisions, to really think about what kind of service they want to have, to be doing that very active service design. Now, there are providers that will help them to do that more effectively, but I think it's a huge cultural shift. So for many organisations, it's not as simple as being able to start and build that SIAM solution from that lovely sort of green field. We have to work with what we've got. So I think SIAM is almost going to have to evolve in many organisations till we get to the stage where we see the benefits of SIAM can't fully be realised in an environment which hasn't been built to allow that to happen.
Yeah. So from a supplier perspective, will suppliers welcome SIAM, or do you think it might be a little bit alarming if you've got a supplier who is coasting away on one of these legacy contracts? Is SIAM going to bring maybe a little bit more accountability than they used to?
Yes, and that's one of the benefits again. Will they like it? Probably not. But I think as people start to see, or suppliers start to see the benefit of their role within that module, the good thing is they also get the ability to be able to demonstrate their specialism. So the reason why they're there, they will have very defined process inputs, process outputs, and sets of quality standards and metrics that they will be measured upon. And they'll also get a view of what that end-to-end solution looks like and what their role is in that. So I think the positives are being able to deliver something that the customer feels is valuable. Being able to be less of a silo mentality and more around an integrated solution. So we are asking providers within the model essentially to worry less about their own commercial feelings and on what they're wanting to deliver, and look more at what the customer is hoping to achieve. I think savvy providers now are realising that is the only way to succeed. Customers' expectation is that's how we're going to operate. We're there to support their business processes. So it's not just about, you know, how do we get the best or how do we get benefit from that whole arrangement. It has to be about how can the integrated solution work for the customer. And I think the customer will very quickly start to move out suppliers who won't fit into that model.
Yeah, I think this is possibly a way to start to distinguish between maybe the good suppliers and the not so good suppliers, the ones that are willing to get on board with this and really start to work towards meeting these customer requirements. But like we said, if the customer hasn't defined the requirements, it's very, very difficult for the supplier then to try and meet them. Doing some research and reading around before we had this conversation, one of the terms that keeps coming up in a SIAM context is service orchestration, and I think it's maybe worth spending a little bit of time on that as well. If you could just give us some definitions for that term and how people might hear it in a SIAM context.
Yeah. So service orchestration is a term that we use really. It's indicative of the role of SIAM as, orchestrating the whole situation. So almost like a conductor, really managing what's going on with the orchestra. When we're talking about orchestration though, again it goes back to what we were saying before. Service orchestration needs very strong footprints, and those strong footprints come from the business really very overtly explaining what their strategy is for IT services. So, that orchestration will start with the IT steering group, as IT calls it, or the IT governance board, who will define what the strategy of the organisation is with regard to IT services. The second layer of orchestration essentially comes from what we were saying before about good service design, enterprise architecture, modular service design, a firm plan about what design services will look like within the organisation and what the level of expectation about providers that come into that model actually will look like. If we go down the level past the customer, the orchestration comes from SIAM control as well. So within the SIAM control level, what we often find is not only control over service management processes that allow us to orchestrate activity, but also things like measurement and monitoring, auditing, continuous service improvement, that kind of thing. But we can also get some orchestration that will come from some of the functional teams that will start to create. So not just the four structures that ITIL talks about, the service desk, technical application operations management, but also structures will create to actually allow the providers within the model to work together. Governance boards, integrated change management boards, service operations and security operations centres. All of those sort of boards or committees are created within the model to essentially allow the providers to play a role, to have their say, to make sure that they can work end to end with their peers. So I guess it's not a quick answer. The orchestration comes to a degree from the business. Strategy and design is fundamental. To a degree from SIAM, the governance layer and some of the structures we put in place, but also from some of the boards or committees that we might create to make sure the providers work together.
Yeah, it's interesting. We had a couple of episodes back, we had Alexander Juk from the Business Relationship Management Institute. He came and spoke to us, and he was talking about the business relationship manager as the conductor of the orchestra, and it's kind of the same theme, is that the business is made up of all these different parts that are involved in service delivery and value creation, and it's having that layer that controls, that governs, that makes sure that things happen in a way that ensures that value is delivered. It is interesting to see these metaphors coming across in different areas of IT service management. I guess the overall idea is the same. So I'm presuming really from what we've been talking about so far that SIAM is mainly for larger organisations. Can you give some examples of the kind of the sectors or the industries where SIAM is coming through strongly?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, you've seen it heavily in the UK and in Australia now. It is becoming very, very popular. So looking really across the piece, many of our customers have either been using SIAM for quite a long time to a degree, albeit there are a variety of different models. Some are using it less than others. But I think now most of the customers that we are talking to are essentially looking at that SIAM solution. So certainly for a Kinetic IT point of view, we work with the larger, small to medium and to the larger enterprises rather than getting involved with the smaller players. But I guess that's where SIAM fits, because you wouldn't really need that SIAM structure in a place where you didn't have a complex provisioning model. You didn't have lots of providers actually working together. It doesn't necessarily need to happen like that if you have a simple model. Maybe you still have internal IT, or maybe just a simple single relationship with another supplier. So it definitely works best in the more complex models or the more complex environments, but most of us, that's where we're operating today, essentially, working with other providers. And I think that's a trend that will continue, because as the customer sees all these fantastic providers out there that can do more and more amazing stuff, they're going to want to start working with them. So I think we almost have a duty as a provider to make sure that we can set ourselves up to allow ourselves to be part of the model that the customer wants to create. Yeah. That's a challenge for us as a service provider. So whilst we need the customer to have a very strong view on their strategy and to influence design very heavily, as a provider, if we want to be considered as part of that delivery model, we need to think about how we're going to do that, and we need to think about readying ourselves to be able to work much better with other suppliers in that sort of post-support chain.
Yeah, I would agree, and I think this is the future really of service provision, is the specialist providers working together under this governance umbrella. And you're absolutely right that there will be some service providers who will need to adapt in order to fit into this new world. So we're coming to the end of our time now. Where can people go and find out more information about SIAM?
There's some fantastic blogs out there now. I'm obviously going to say, have a look at the white paper that we produced. This is on AXELOS' website. There are lots of papers there. Kevin Holland has produced a paper, and he supported the paper that we produced for AXELOS. There's a lot of information. People are talking about it on Twitter, on LinkedIn. As I say, there's various sources that are available. So I think a simple search on SIAM it comes out with all kinds of fantastic stuff. We are today seeing lots more information going down into the details of what that SIAM structure would look like. So I've talked about governance and committees and so on. We're actually in the process at Kinetic IT of producing a second paper where we want to explore that in a little bit more detail. So to build on that functional, structural model that we think is very, very necessary in that multi-provider environment.
Fantastic. And if you've got any questions that you want to ask Michelle about SIAM, if you use the hashtag ITSM crowd on Twitter, we'll monitor that and we'll get back to you, and you can see Michelle's Twitter handle at the bottom of the screen as well. So I'm sure Michelle would be very happy to hear from you if you've got questions about SIAM. So some really interesting stuff today. I want to say a huge thank you to Michelle for joining us at the end of her day in Australia. Thank you, Michelle. I think that was a really useful conversation, and we look forward to seeing you all on the next episode of the ITSM Crowd. Thank you.
Thanks.